Well, I think that our speaker today actually needs very little introduction. We're so honored to have him as our presenter today. As probably many of you know, he's President and Chief Technology Officer on the Board of Directors for the Warner Babcock Institute for Green Chemistry. He's perhaps better known for being the co-author of the text Green Chemistry in Practice with Paul and Astis. Paul are considered the fathers of green chemistry, and he has published over 200 patents, papers, and books. But I'm really not going to spend a lot of with his introduction. You can find all of the details you can find on our website. To turn it over to John and take it away, John.
Great. Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you, Clinton. I'm very happy to be asked to give this talk today. It's my pleasure. It's very strange for me. I'm used to speaking to people and seeing their faces and things like that, and modify my talk by, if someone's head is starting to hit the ground, I change what I'm saying to try to get them back awake. Here in a completely disembodied function, it's something new to me, but I'll do the best that I can. I wanted to give this talk in a different kind of way and go through some observations, some comments, and now after being at this for, over 20 years now, I've kind of picked up some interesting observations, and so I wanted to run it by all of you. And so some of these slides you've seen before. A lot of them are brand new. This will be the first time that I'm presenting some of this information ever, so I welcome the feedback either immediately or over time, as we go forward. But I want to start by just a bunch of observations. And one of the observations that I've come to realize is that our society, for whatever reason, pays more attention to identifying and describing a problem than solving a problem. What do I mean by that? It's kind of interesting. I've been a chemist for over 32 years. I'm getting old. And over my career, I've published well over 200 papers and patents and abstracts of talks and various things like that. And, I've probably in my life invented a couple dozen technologies that arguably have replaced hazardous things with real-world solutions to those problems that actually remove that hazard from that application. And, I don't know that many people on the phone know any of those inventions. It's a strange thing. However, a couple years ago, I was interviewed by a magazine, and I made a casual mention of bisphenol A being in cash register receipts. And for the next 6 months, oh my God, 6 countries called me, governments, 5 television shows, 20 radio shows, infinite number of magazines and things. It was interesting that I suggested that BPA was a problem because it was in cash register receipts. And throughout my career, I got far more attention because of that single statement than all the things that I did to invent the alternative. And I find that kind of interesting. In fact, I was even in Woman's World magazine in February on the same page as a cat pushing a shopping carriage, which it talks about John Warner identifying BPA and cash register receipts. Now, this is important. People need to know the problems that they're facing. But I think we need to step back and ask ourselves, are we spending an equal amount, or at least an appropriate amount of time, trying to identify the solutions to the problems as we are trying to identify the problems themselves? A second observation that I've made that's kind of interesting is that many people have an all-or-nothing mentality when it comes to sustainability. What I mean by that, this manifests itself in many ways, but in the science community, I'm actually going to show you guys a slide of, Robert Burns Woodward is the Nobel laureate in chemistry, is, in my opinion, the most famous organic chemist that ever lived. And here I have a slide that shows the multiple step synthesis of a famous molecule called reserpine. If we were to go, all of us were to go to a science seminar, some technical talk where some person has been working on this synthesis, and they give a brilliant presentation of this synthesis. And then after the talk, people will ask questions like, ooh, what was the regiospecificity of this reaction here? Or perhaps did you see any rearranged product at this point? Or what was the effect of pH on this reaction? And every question will be probing the scientific methodology used. Now, if that person gave exactly the same talk, but at 1 second in their presentation just made side mention, I used water instead of dichloromethane in this step, and then everything else was identical. Ironically, every question afterwards would be, well, isn't this toxic? Isn't this toxic? Isn't this hazardous? If the person mentions sustainability, every question is, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do this? They get a pass if they don't mention it, but if they mention it just a little, we beat them up because they didn't do enough. And I think we need to step back and think a little bit about that observation, that science doesn't work that way. Very rarely are there all or nothings, and just kind of explore that reaction that we have to people that are trying to do a little bit, and then it's almost better that they say nothing than they say a little. And so it's just another observation. Now again, let me quick give a background of green chemistry. I want to make a first an initial disclaimer that I am not so presumptuous to say that anything that I think anyone else needs subscribe to. That my attitude is that I've been on this earth for 50 years. I've developed my way of looking at the world that works for me. I am happy to share that as my perspective, but no way am I saying anyone else needs subscribe to the way I look at the world. So as I give this presentation and I give my thoughts, please make sure that you understand I'm not so presumptuous to believe I have all the answers. It works for me. And if anything I have to say helps anyone else put things in perspective, great. But this isn't, I'm not preaching that this is the way it must be. This is just what works for me. Now, you guys know that, Paul Anastas and I, we wrote the book on green chemistry now quite a few years ago, and that the technical definition, green chemistry, the design of chemical products and processes that reduce or eliminate the use or generation of hazardous substances. Two things I have on blue in this slide is design and use and or generation. I think that those are key because the whole point of green chemistry is to design materials that are safe, environmentally benign, and non-toxic. It's not so much an evaluation of products and services. The whole intent was to get at the design stage of a process. And then the second thing is use and or generation, meaning it's not just about the end product. This isn't just a measure of the sustainability, toxicity, whatever environmental impact that a product has at when the consumer is touching it, but green chemistry seeks to look at the entire life cycle and go back, how is it manufactured and everything like that. So those two things I want to highlight as being kind of critical. And of course, this, Paul and I were, I think equally stunned at, how the world reacted to this book. We did not, when we wrote this book, think that, it would make as much of a hit as it did. Well, obviously we're pleased, but these two kids from Quincy write this book. It gets translated into, I think it's now 15 different languages. In my opinion, what differentiates green chemistry from other methodologies that are equally important and equally valid for different purposes is that the 12 principles of green chemistry, in my opinion, are kind of like a checklist that speaks to the designer, the chemical or materials designer, to essentially what they can do to address these issues. Okay, and so it's not really a government policy program. It's not really, something that's more aspirational. This is the intent, in my opinion, is to be able to actually affect change. You measure, one can measure sustainability in any way that they want, but if they want to improve the sustainability performance, they use the 12 principles, and I'll come back to that thought in a minute. But what I have to make a very important understanding is that in no way do I feel that green chemistry is a birth of ethics in chemistry. Okay, it isn't as if people doing chemistry that have been working in the chemical industry before green chemistry were somehow absent of an ethical compulsion. It is my assumption that people have always cared deeply about human health, the environment, they love their children, they want the world to be a better place. Green chemistry is not introducing this kind of ethic to chemistry. I strongly believe that the people that were being chemists long before green chemistry came on board cared. But where there's a difference is in the approach. What I mean by that is that I feel that when I went to school as a chemist, it was well known that chemistry was dangerous, and it was assumed it had to be. There was no question that green chemistry had to be dangerous, but that you accepted that risk because you were making drugs to cure sick people, you were making new materials to do amazing things, and agricultural agents to feed the sick, and so we took it as a sacrifice upon ourselves to work with toxic materials because of the better good that it's doing. But it was okay because we would wear gloves to protect our skin, we'd wear masks to protect our lungs, we'd wear goggles to protect our eyes, we'd install scrubbers and smokestacks to protect the air, the land, and the sea. That's how we could get away with working with nasty things, because we would protect the outside world by mitigating exposure. Now, obviously, this works to a certain extent, and there's been Herculean efforts to develop even better technologies to protect people. But if you think about it, every time a disaster has happened, every time something bad has happened where human health or the environment has been put in peril, it wasn't as if these technologies were absent. They failed. A glove developed a pinhole, a mask failed, the scrubber in a smokestack stopped working, other things happened. We are dependent on these technologies for the future, but if green chemistry is seen as a revolution changing, this is where it's changing the mindset, because what it's doing is it's saying we're mitigating risk not through exposure control, but in fact doing it through the intrinsic hazard in the first place. And if there's one central idea that is green chemistry, it is this. It is that when one designs a molecule, if I want to make a red pigment for a textile, I know what color red I need to make it. I know that I want it to stick to the fabric. I know that I don't want it to oxidize in the air. I know that I don't want it to fade. Actually, what I also want to do is make sure it's not a carcinogen, it's not toxic, and there's no environmental negatives. That is the part that is green chemistry, is to add to the criteria those things as part of the design. So it's not as if people weren't doing it already, but it was done in a more haphazard way. Whereas what green chemistry is saying, let's create the criteria to do this in the same way that we would measure the color of a molecule or would measure how to make it stick to a fabric or anything else. How do we measure how to make something that is environmentally benign and non-toxic in the first place? So the mindset was back in the early 90s when the Pollution Prevention Act was happening, is that, you know, we looked at it and said, people don't talk about making things environmentally benign. God knows that scientists love to have conferences. Every day there are hundreds and hundreds of conferences across the world on all kinds of different topics. Back in the early 90s, there was no science called green chemistry, and so there was no way for scientists to talk about their advances in making things that are less carcinogenic or making things that are less, you know, neurotoxic or use less energy or be more biodegradable or whatnot. There was no mechanism to communicate that advance, and so it was really just a bunch of random happenstances. And so the green chemistry was designed to create a science. So there could be journals called green chemistry. So there could be conferences called green chemistry. So there could be webinars in the Great Lakes about green chemistry to attract the scientific population to share ideas and grow. That's how you solve problems, if you get people of common cause to be sharing it as a science. So the 12 principles of green chemistry were designed to create that. So it wasn't that people didn't care about it already. It was that this moved it from some nebulous, gee, we should really kind of do this, to this is how you do it. Let's create a science around it, and let's do it from that perspective. So that's the point. And now, of course, you know, anyone who's heard me talk understands that I have, you know, very, very strong, you know, opinions about our education system, because, of course, we aren't currently training chemists to understand these issues. You know, and you know, in 2008, this is the latest data that I could find, we graduated just in the United States, not worldwide, just in the United States, nearly over 18,000 undergraduate degrees in chemistry and chemical engineering, over 3,000 master's degrees, and over 3,000 doctoral degrees in chemistry. I like this statistic because I think it's important. In 2004 was the first time more women became chemists than men. All right, and so right now we have this thing in which we really need to be teaching what are the implications of chemicals on reproductive health, on human health, on environmental health, and yet right now, to get a degree in chemistry, still today, I've been at this for a long time, there are no chemistry programs in the country, and there's some things happening in other countries that might qualify, but certainly in the United States, there is still no universities that require students who are going to go out and practice chemistry in the outside world to have any knowledge of toxicity and environmental impact. And so I feel that really to move this ball forward, it isn't just about looking at products and saying to industry, you should make safe products. I really think that to really make a change, to really change the world and move us on a sustainable pathway, we got to look at how do we train scientists and what tools do we give them so when they get into industry, they're capable of solving these problems. Okay, and so that's the way that I look at this, and so I feel that as important as it is to be working with industry to create sustainable technologies, it's also really important to look at how we manufacture, if you will, chemists in the first place. Okay, and so, I love the American Chemical Society. I've been a lifelong member. The moment I became a chemistry major as an undergraduate, I joined, and I've been a member ever since. They do amazing things. The field of chemistry, its journals, its conferences, everything that the ACS does is really amazing. But just because something is excellent doesn't mean it couldn't be better. I feel that the ACS is still not quite up to speed with the moral and ethical component and the global competitiveness component that is necessary to introduce these concepts to the chemistry curriculum. Right now the ACS has these guidelines. They're not mandatory. Universities don't have to use these guidelines. It's really voluntary, but they provide guidelines that if you're giving a degree in chemistry, you should have calculus, you should have biochemistry, you have instrumentation, independent work. Still in 2012, there's really no emphasis in toxicology, environmental impact, sustainability, law and policy. They're trying. I do believe that this next round, I have all my hopes and dreams that ACS is gonna have the next round do it. Right now, all they do is they preach to the choir. If a student is interested, well, a department should do what they can to help them. But I feel that this isn't those that are interested. I think that there is an imperative that anyone who is going to go out and make a new molecule be given the tools to assess whether what they're about to make is potentially the most toxic neurotoxin in history, a carcinogen or not. And until we address how we teach scientists, we've still got a long way to go. I'll get off that soapbox now. With some of my students back when I was a professor, and I continue at the Institute with Beyond Benign, we do publish a lot. Way back in, we've been at this for almost a decade now, that Nick Anastas, Paul Anastas' brother, and I have actually published papers on how do you design product, what is a logical flow of how you identify and design molecules that are non-toxic, okay? And so there are papers that one can find that give these kinds of flow charts that we've been working on. This is part of that academic structure. But the other thing is the EPA right now has websites and tools that one can log on to and assess the potential toxicity of molecules. Most universities graduate students having never even heard of those freely available tools. So it's not the sophisticated fine-tuning. I'm talking just big picture general stuff. And next month, Amy Cannon, the executive director of Beyond Benign, will be speaking specifically on this subject. So I'll get off my soapbox now and move on. Okay, so we all have jobs to do in sustainability, and in no way will I ever suggest that green chemistry is more important or less important. We all have our roles to play. And so sometimes people, I think legitimately say, oh, how does green chemistry fit in with like alternatives assessment? And I actually think they're critically linked together. And this is a hand-in-hand. We've got to work together. And this is the way that I look at it. Is, if you think of all the products and processes, everything that's available to society from a chemicals and material science perspective, I would argue that if we do an assessment and we try to evaluate the toxicity, environmental impact, sustainability, whatever metric we want to, probably 10% or less will pass muster in everyone's eyes. 90% of the things that we're doing out there have problems. They might, have a toxic intermediate. They might be persistent in the environment. They might be non-biodegradable. Who knows, what might be going on, too much energy in the manufacturing. We have a long way to go. Now, if people do an alternatives assessment and seek what is the best opportunities that are out there right now so that you just change in your supply chain and you get a better material, it is my belief that you're going to win 25% of the time. At best, that's the best that we can do, is that there are 25% of the time we can find something better to improve the lot. But in my estimation, there's at least 65% or more haven't been invented yet. This isn't people making choices because they just choose to not make the change. It is my wholehearted belief, being at this for so long, that the alternatives don't exist. And so it's not picking and choosing down the supply chain for a better thing. It's really, how do we get people to invent them in the first place? And if education isn't teaching the students how to do it, well, how do we get from point A to point B? And so that's the way that I look at this the whole role of the difference between alternative assessment and green chemistry. Now, what I'm saying, though, is when green chemistry invents a new alternative, we got to rely on alternative assessment to make sure we're playing in the right game. And so alternative assessment steers green chemistry into what to invent, because they're identifying the needs, and then they're keeping us honest afterwards, because once we do invent, we're going to make sure that we are, in fact, more sustainable than we were. So it's not an either-or situation. We need to be working hand in hand, but we're going to recognize what happens when an alternative assessment falls short and fails to identify a better alternative. Right now, if the chemist and the designers aren't at the table inventing, we just use the bad. And so going forward, this is what we need to do. Now, the chemical enterprises, in my opinion, have been around for over 150 years. Lavoisier, back in the 1800s, arguably one of the founders of the field of chemistry and material science. It's been around for a long time. Okay, we have all of our products, all our goods and services. Everything has been evolved over a century and a half. Now, green chemistry has just come on the scene very recently. There's no magic switch that we can throw, and tomorrow everything instantly become green. This is going to take decades and decades of figuring out how to make a molecule that is non-toxic in this environment, how to make a molecule that's not going to be persistent in the environment, how to make a molecule to do all these different things. And so, if we're going to want these 65% other materials to be invented, we have to realize that we're going to have to be patient. We can't insist on it immediately, because then it's not going to happen that way. That's not the way science grows. And so that's the way I look at that. And it's important to really kind of put it in the perspective of, where do products come from? If you think about it, molecules, we turn them into materials, and then we call that basic research. Then we take materials and we turn them into components. We call that applied research. We turn components into devices. We call that development. And then we make a bunch of them, and we call that manufacturing. Now, obviously, this whole process has got the environment in dead center, right? Where do those molecules come from in the first place? And after the product is done, where does it go at the end of its life? Well, obviously, all of these interactions with the environment is what we're talking about. Now, there are important roles for everyone in this process to play. I would argue that smart manufacturers are already caring about the environment, smart people that are building market cases. There's a lot going on historically for the last several decades to try to think this through. But I feel, in my opinion, that places where changes must happen is here where the chemists play. And in fact, like I said, that's kind of new on the scene. No college, no university is training chemists to understand the environmental implications of basic research and applied research. So all we can do is rely on alternative assessment right now, because those are the only people that are trying. Until we change the game here in basic and applied research, we're stuck with what we're stuck. That's the imperative, is how do we get in and train the future chemists and the existing chemists. Next question is about chemicals and green chemistry and how it relates to chemicals policy. Okay, now this is something that has often people have misunderstood. Let me make a disclaimer right now. We urgently need excellent chemicals policy. Chemicals policy protects human health and the environment, and the people who are working in chemicals policy are literally heroically doing important work. Green chemistry is not a replacement for that work. Let me say that a second time. Green chemistry is not a replacement for that work. The problem, as I see it, is chemicals policy works on the demand side, and they can do an excellent job at creating the demand. But if we don't have chemists inventing the alternatives, we're kind of stuck at an impasse. And so I don't believe green chemistry can be, as effective as possible without good chemicals policy. I'm not so naive to believe it's just going to spontaneously happen. So chemicals policy is still an important part of our future and forever. And so green chemistry isn't to displace chemicals policy, it's to work with it. But all the demand in the world, if we don't have the skill set to invent the alternatives, the demand just simply, in my opinion, isn't enough. And so we need both, not one or the other. We need both. And so that's how, in my opinion, green chemistry fits with chemicals policy, is they go hand in hand. How about the bigger picture of sustainability? This is another really, frustrating thing. I'll editorialize in a second. But first of all, the disclaimer, this is the way I look at the world. I am not presumptuous enough to believe that anyone listening to me right now need adopt what I'm about to say. It works for me. And the way I look at this is I see sustainability as an overarching concept. An overarching concept that touches every aspect of human existence. We could talk about sustainable economics, or agriculture, or education, or business, or chemistry, or engineering. We could slice this pie up in millions of different ways. Sustainability touches all aspects. If we look at the part that deals with chemistry and materials, we call that sustainable chemistry. Okay? And in sustainable chemistry, we could talk about chemicals policy. We could talk about remediation technologies. We could talk about exposure controls. We could talk about green chemistry as a subset of sustainable chemistry, water purification, alternative energy, all kinds of others. On the EPA website, it says in glaring letters, green chemistry, also known as sustainable chemistry. They have an absolute right to their opinion. I don't agree. I feel that sustainable chemistry and green chemistry are not synonymous, that there's a big difference. Green chemistry is an overarching principle that talks about policy. If you have a hazardous material and you develop better exposure controls, there is an aspect of that that touches sustainability. We need water purification technologies. That is a sustainable chemistry. We need alternative energies. That is a sustainable chemistry technology. But if I make a solar panel with toxic materials, we need it. Okay, sustainable energy is a requirement. We haven't finished our job yet, though. Is that truly sustainable if it's using toxic materials? In 20 years, when we unbolt it and put it in a landfill, what happens to those toxic materials? So I'm not suggesting we don't develop alternative energy. We need it. It's desperate. But it is a sustainable technology, sustainable chemistry. But what green chemistry is it's actually application agnostic, in my opinion. There is no such thing as a green chemistry technology. Green chemistry is a mechanism that goes into everything. And so the building blocks that make a solar energy panel, if they're done with minimal impact on human health and the environment, that's where green chemistry plays. If you make a water purification device and the molecules that go into making that water filtration device are toxic, if you make them less toxic, that's green chemistry. If you make a pharmaceutical, that the manufacturing process is less toxic or it has less environmental impact. So essentially what green chemistry is saying is the building blocks, the solvents, the catalysts, the renewable feedstocks, the toxicity, the persistence, the energy use. You know, obviously I have a bias. I would look at this in 12 different ways and look at it as the 12 principles of green chemistry. This is how I look at how green chemistry is a subset of sustainable chemistry, which is a subset of the big picture sustainability. And in no way do I think green chemistry is any more important than anything else that people are doing. The only difference with green chemistry is that is the thing that chemists can do to participate in this very important structure. But it doesn't mean that it's the only thing that needs to be done. There are a lot of other things that need to be done. Green chemistry fits as a piece into a many-piece puzzle. So that's the way that I look at it. I try to be completely non-presumptuous. It doesn't do everything. We need a lot more than just green chemistry. But if you're a chemist working in a lab, green chemistry is the way that you participate in sustainability. That's my view on that. All right, so the other thing I want to talk about is green chemistry wasn't originally designed as an assessment tool. It can be used as such, but it really was designed as a design tool. Okay, and what I mean, I use golf as a metaphor for this. I am a horrible golfer. My wife, Amy, is an amazing golfer, so I can use this analogy because I've watched her golf. If you got a bunch of golfers together and you wanted to assess their game, you could set them up and you could have them, how far can they drive, how straight does the golfer hit, how accurate is the short game, how do they get out of traps, how consistent, and you could set up an Excel spreadsheet to measure those golfers. So if you had 5 golfers, you filled out an Excel spreadsheet, you could say on this course, this golfer's going to win, this golfer's going to come in second. These are measurable attributes, and they're very important to understand how good a golfer is. But what if you want to do better? What if you want to improve? Does knowing these numbers do anything to make you better? It's important. It's critical. No way do I think it's not a critical part of the puzzle, but it doesn't help you make it better. You know, my wife has screamed at me, drive straighter, and I don't. You know, knowing that I drive bad doesn't make me any better. Where what you have to do if you want to improve the golf game is you go to the intangibles. How does the golfer grip the club? How does the golfer hold their shoulders? How do they place their feet? How do they swing the club? You know, all those kinds of things there. Those are the adjustable components that are a little less easy to measure and to put on an Excel spreadsheet, but critical to improve the performance from a sustainability perspective. So that's how green chemistry fits into that perspective. We need the assessment tools. They are critical. We have to continue to improve them, and people should use them. But if we want to improve and make that assessment tool come out better tomorrow, green chemistry is the mechanism that helps us improve. So green chemistry is the verb, assessment is the noun. And so that's kind of the way I look at it from a sustainability perspective. Life cycle evaluation, if you look at all the 12 principles of green chemistry and you spread out a life cycle assessment, in my words, going from environment to environment, you can see that if you look at marketing, marketing only touches a few of the 12 principles, but if you look at research and development, you see that it touches all of them. That's what I mean when I say that green chemistry is best fit for an R&D effort. The business issues of green chemistry. Obviously, the Pike Research came out with this report recently, and you guys can look at this. I'm sure you're all aware of it, that the prediction is by 2020, green chemistry is a $100 billion market. It is my assumption that every company gets this, wants to do it. They're struggling because their workforce isn't capable of delivering it, but that doesn't mean they don't want it. And so how do you live in a world where you want something, but you can't have it because the training isn't quite up to snuff yet? And so essentially, you know, from a business perspective, obviously it's not enough just to have an environmentally benign alternative. You also have to have something that's going to perform better, and it's going to have to be more economical, or no one's going to buy it. And so you can have the greatest sustainable technology in the world, but if it doesn't work and it's too expensive, no one's going to use it. So if we're really going to make inroads, we need all 3 of these things. We need to have the safety, the performance, and the cost. However, you know, when you really think about this, you know, people oftentimes talk about this 3-legged stool of environment, cost, and performance, and I only use it tongue-in-cheek because I actually don't believe entirely in this picture. What do I mean by that? If you're in business and you're selling a product, all right, I get performance, I get cost. If I talk about the environment, I'm just going to get beat up at the boardroom because, well, how is that going to help the bottom line, blah, blah, blah. It sometimes gets a little nebulous. And I think it's a mistake to actually focus on that as a third tier. When in fact, if you have an educated consumer, if people on this phone call who are dedicated to educating the population about the risks of chemicals in the environment do their job and they start demanding products that are safe, that isn't an environmental issue, it's a performance issue. Okay, so marketing can in fact address this thing. Is, if the consumers want a safe product, that's not an environmental issue, it's a performance issue. And if people working in regulatory worlds are developing regulations to make it more problematic to have a nasty thing, that's not an environmental issue, it's a cost issue. So if we do our jobs right, we don't have to ask for people to be doing this out of altruism. It really ends up being a cost and performance issue, which is the language of business. Okay, and so yes, I personally feel passionate about the environment and think that it should stand alone. And if, I don't know that we would want a world where I was capable of engineering human thought. It would be a very dangerous, scary world. But, so let's assume that I can't do that. So the next best thing is how do we make this work that is consistent with existing market drivers. And so that's the way I look at how that all fits together. And 5 years ago, Amy Cannon and I, in collaboration with Jim Babcock, we started the Warner Babcock Institute for Green Chemistry and Beyond Benign, the nonprofit that's doing the education work. Joe Pont is the CEO of the Warner Babcock Institute. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to fly through this. A lot of people ask me to give a little bit more information on what the heck is the Warner Babcock Institute and how does this fit into the grand scheme. The PowerPoint slides will be available, but essentially we're 15 miles north of Boston in Wilmington, Mass. It is a 42,000 square foot research facility to die for. Every piece of scientific research equipment that I've ever needed in my life is all under one roof. Jim Babcock is an amazing person that has enabled this institute to come into existence, and we really touch all aspects of industry. So our core technologies, I won't waste your time, there are 6 things that we do at the Institute that are really kind of unique to us as chemists in way of changing molecules and materials. And we apply these core technologies to 5 different industry sectors. And these are the energy and the environment, chemical sciences, textiles, materials and coatings, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, biotech, cosmetics, personal care, and consumer. And what the Institute does is we have 2 models. One model is we'll work with a company that comes to us and asks us to help them invent a technology. We charge our cost. Okay, and so what they do is they pay our cost. We don't profit. We work for 6 to 9 months to develop the technology at cost. If we succeed and they use it in the marketplace, we want some compensation for that success, be it royalties if it works for them or some other milestone payments. But that's the way we do one thing. And then the second model is we are creating joint ventures and creating independent companies to go and pursue some of our dream research at the same time. So we kind of do a little bit of both. Some examples, people have seen me sometimes with dark hair, sometimes with gray hair. We've invented a non-toxic, environmentally benign hair coloring system. We've invented a non-toxic photoresist cleaning solution. We've got increased bioavailability for neuropharmaceuticals. This is 3 of 25 different examples of things that we're working on. I invite anyone that's interested to look at the website. But this is how I have chosen to manifest green chemistry in the real world. I've decided to give up my full tenured position at a university, chair of the chemistry department, and all this activity and stuff. And I said I put it all at risk because I figured if I could start a company dedicated to the 12 principles of green chemistry and succeed and actually be successful at that, what would be more powerful information as far as green chemistry is concerned? We are in our 5th year in history's worst economy. We've doubled in size every year. We've filed nearly 300 provisional patents, and things are working pretty well, not in spite of green chemistry, because of green chemistry. And I think that's my closing thought, is that people sometimes think that green chemistry is this awful tasting medicine that we have to ram down the throats of industry or whatever. It is not. It is a a shot in the arm of innovation, of creativity, and it's not a set of handcuffs. It's a liberating way of being truly more innovative in the research labs. Well, that's my story. I've run out of time. Einstein said it best: problems can't be solved at the same level of awareness that created it. Green chemistry, the work that everyone on this call, I assume, is doing in this place, they're all doing Herculean efforts that are changing the world. You know, Lynn and Clinton are helping communicate this to everyone. I'm so proud to be a part of this and to be able to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Saying thank you, John. That was really a very, very broad and comprehensive, I think, look at a lot of issues going on in green chemistry right now. So we're waiting for questions to pop up here. I wanted to just go back to something that you had mentioned in the course of your presentation, and frankly, it's not something that I ever had thought about or would have ever, expressed in this way, but I have heard people say, and you alluded to the fact that some people think that green chemistry is a replacement for other chemistry, and maybe you want to just amplify on that a little bit, John.
Okay, there's two aspects of that. First is how it fits in with what people are doing in the sustainability world that aren't chemists. And so there's chemicals policy advocates, there is, consumer advocates, there's NGOs that are working on ridding the world of hazardous materials. Their work is critical, and green chemistry in no way replaces that. Okay, I have been brokenhearted time and time again where I end up someone who should be my best collaborator, that we're in the same thing, trying to do the same thing, we end up fighting with each other because they accuse me of somehow trying to change the story. And there's no attempt to do that, in my opinion. We need strong and better chemicals policy, and we need strong and better advocacy across the board, period. Green chemistry is an addition to that process, not a replacement of anything going on in that process. The two of them go hand in hand. Now, as far as chemistry is concerned, again, I would not in my wildest dreams believe that green chemistry is somehow to replace current chemistry. Okay, chemistry is a brilliant science. We have amazing chemists across the world that are constantly doing fantastic things. No one needs change what they're doing in some heretical way. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. Again, just because you've got something that's really going well still doesn't mean it couldn't be improved. All I'm suggesting is that we take a look at how we train the scientists and get more information into their hands. Yes, I know the curriculum is crowded. Yes, I know that their curriculum isn't even available by and large. That's why Beyond Benign is doing what it's doing. So it isn't really a criticism of how we teach chemistry. We're doing amazing things, and I think the field of chemistry has a lot to be proud of. But green chemistry needs to be added, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. One university might want to have a required course for all students. Another university might want to integrate it into many different courses. Another university might want to have it integrated into their labs. There are people working on all the diversity, and we have to have all different approaches. There's no one-size-fits-all. All I ask is that it be not just to the students that are interested, but it be to all students. If you think about it, many professions have licensure. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, nurses, architects all have to have a license and have to renew that license on a periodic basis. In chemistry, we have no such thing. Anyone can make a molecule that has never existed before, and never in their training have they ever had any training how to identify hazard and potential impact on the environment. We need to change that. So it's not to replace the chemistry curriculum, it's to add to it. And I realize it's hard, and that's why Beyond Benign is dedicating a massive amount of work and energy to try to come up with ways that can help each organization try to do this. And you'll hear a lot more about that from Amy next month.
Great. I do now have a bunch of questions which we'll try to get through. Can you give some more details about some of the promising chemistries coming out of Warner Babcock?
We got a lot of interesting things that are going on. One of the policies that we have is that I will never put the logo of a company that I'm working with on the screen. I feel that it's up to them to be successful without us, and if we can help them for a period of time, that's great. But that's just my feeling. It's not from them requesting it. It's me personally saying I'm not going to list the names of the companies. But we have, one of the issues that we've got is this thing called non-covalent derivatization. In the pharmaceutical industry, there are two huge issues that are around pharmaceuticals and the environment. One is that, obviously, if people are measuring, drinking water in municipalities and increasing amounts of pharmaceuticals are appearing in water supplies, we need to deal with that. And one way to deal with that is to lower the dose that people take. And most people don't realize this, but when you take a prescription drug, you probably, 80 to 90% of it you're excreting out because everyone's different in how they absorb. If we can make more targeted pharmaceuticals, then we can lower the amount of stuff that's going into humans. And obviously, if there's a lower dosage, we're manufacturing a lot less. And so that's one area where we've been working in anti-cancer and antibiotics, in neurological diseases. That's one area. In cosmetics, we have a whole bunch of different applications. We have hair coloring, hair curling, and things like that. In electronics, we have some alternative energy programs. We have some photoresist technologies. And, I can go on and on. If anyone wants to look on the website, there's some examples there, but we're trying to, what's beautiful is we focus on molecules, not on the application. We partner with people who understand the applications. We know molecules, hydrogen bonding and pi stacking and stuff like that. We work with people who know their business. We know at the molecular level how to build in sustainability. So we'll take on anything that has a molecule in it.
I think that's we have a great segue into our next question, but before I answer that, somebody asked if there would be an encore presentation, and I just want to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and that you will be able to access it hopefully within a week at our website, which is www.glgc.org. It's on your screen right now, or through the Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse, www.migreenchemistry, I think it's .org as well. And in any case, you can see it on your screens right now. So we will not be having an encore, but they will be available. So I'm going to try to rush in some questions. We have several. And building on your golfer analogy, merely changing grip or stance may make you a better golfer, but professional golfers have certain physical attributes like eye-hand coordination or muscular strength, flexibility that just can't be changed on an individual. Isn't that true of chemistry and chemicals, that some are just so good they can't be replaced?
Yes and no. First of all, one disclaimer, I would suggest that no chemist be hired solely because they do green chemistry. In industry, we need excellent world-class scientists that can invent technologies. Green chemistry alone is not an employable field. Someone who does medicinal chemistry at an excellent level, who adds green chemistry, is now world-class. Someone who works in the electronics industry who also knows green chemistry is now world-class. And so doing green chemistry alone will never replace being an excellent chemist in the first place. So that's comment number one. Comment number two, yes. Today, it is inconceivable. There are certain molecules that are out there that have performance that, man, they still have this problem, but, oh, God, are they amazing. And we can never replace them. Well, as a scientist, I never want to believe something is truly impossible. They could be impossible by today's standards and by today's level of understanding. But that doesn't mean 20, 30, 40 years from now that something couldn't happen. And so, yes, there are some, we have to pick and choose what we're going to work on short term, middle term and long term. And some things are just so difficult to imagine a change that I don't expect to see a change in my lifetime. And anyone working in that industry probably has job security because it's so difficult to replace. But I also refuse to say it can never happen. We can't have anyone in science that says something can never happen. I'm skeptical. We got to be more optimistic about that. It may be very difficult and take decades to do, but that's not the same as saying it can never be done. And so from a business perspective, there are nevers, obviously, because there's a certain box of reality. But yes, there are Herculean molecules that are very difficult to right now conceive of a good replacement. And either legislative action is going to have to change that equation if it's truly nasty, or market forces will have to change that equation if it's truly nasty, or we're just going to have to be patient and realize it's going to take a long time to invent that alternative.
Next question, John, is with your experience in a private research center, do you see opportunities for public or public-private organizations or centers?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and again, it's an interesting, again, it's another commentary I can't help but make that, if I wanted to get an investment, a charitable foundation to give me money to document the toxicity of a material, there are a handful of organizations that will give me money to inject bunnies and mice and watch them die some horrible death and document the toxicity of a material. If I wanted to wear a sign on my chest and go downtown Boston and tell people that some of the products that they're buying that they're exposed to are going to hurt them, there are organizations that will give me money to do that. But if I want to invent a technology to remove that toxic material from the face of the earth, the organizations that would give me money to document its toxicity, the organizations that will give me money to communicate that problem to the outside world will not give money for inventing the solution. All of a sudden, the discussion becomes return on investment. This is somehow a product. There's no return on the investment of the toxicity of a material being documented or communicated. But to solve the problem, all of a sudden, that becomes a different aspect of this problem solving. And that's weird. And so we really need to, again, kind of evaluate the relationships of organizations that have historically been helpful in identifying the problems and documenting and communicating the problems, but not being there to actually help invent the solutions, because now all of a sudden that's profit-driven. And so why does it have to be? Really, when you get down to it, why does that have to be profit-driven? Why can't it just be communicated and in some way found to do that? Now, obviously, research is a very expensive enterprise. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to invent a new technology and to test it and to see if it's going to be competitive. It's not something that just happens, and it's very difficult for a university to do those real-world experiments that are relevant to industry. And so having some form of investment that isn't just focused on the return on the investment, but let's just get rid of this molecule in commerce. I haven't found it yet. The Warner Babcock Institute is a for-profit company, not because I want it to be a for-profit company, but it's the only way that I can do what I do. There is no mechanism to do this in the nonprofit world yet. No one has found that way.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I think most of the public-private formations that we've seen are really geared to lab-to-market kinds of things. Can you elaborate on your answer, John, to talk a little bit more about this?
Well, again, the thing is that there is a pathway. There's an idea in somebody's head. Okay, so somebody is thinking about an idea, and they want to test it out and see, well, gee, is this possibly a replacement for bisphenol A on polycarbonates? Is this possibly a replacement for brominated flame retardants? Is this possibly a replacement for phthalates? Is this possibly a replacement for whatever? To do that first set of experiments to see if it even has a chance of working is a couple $100,000. Now, once you know, hey, this has legs, this might really work, then it's almost $1 million to say, is it practical? Is it cost effective? Is it something that the market will actually bear? If it's too expensive or it doesn't work quite well enough, well, it's great if you get a laboratory experiment that you can publish in a journal, but can it actually survive in commerce? And that, like I said, is close to $1 million of investment to get to that point. And then now, obviously, to commercialize it, an organization, if they have to retool their manufacturing line, now you can be talking an awful lot of money to do that. And so the expense, the additional expense going down the road is difficult. But it is my opinion that it is the early stage stuff that society is missing. It's that industry doesn't have options. You know, they might have a replacement polymer for PVC, but man, it melts in the back of an 18-wheeler when it's being transported. They may have a replacement for a phthalate as a plasticizer, but man, the plastic is crystallizing in this certain environment. You know, so there's always a technical hurdle that hasn't been accomplished yet, and so that's not about sustainability, it's about innovation and creativity, and man, that costs money, and we don't have a mechanism to fund that research. Academia is great at doing some things, to come up with that first idea, gee whiz, isn't this interesting? But actually, will it work in the real world in a cost-effective way? That really isn't, that isn't where academics, you know, have their strengths.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to sort of switch gears now, and but in a somewhat related question, you're asked, how do externalities get priced into products?
Well, obviously, the success of any organization is based on their ability to recognize, understand, and calculate their externalities. You know, probably I would you know, make this tongue-in-cheek assessment that a successful organization figures that out. A non-successful organization never figures that out, and it ends up not being successful. You know, I have always felt that, you know, the cost effectiveness of green chemistry goes far beyond just, you know, performance and cost, but there are other aspects. Back when I was a professor at a university, I had 30, 35 people working in my research lab. Every year, my annual budget for buying molecules, I would buy from different vendors these chemicals, this chemical, and I'd spend an enormous amount of money paying to buy chemicals. However, covered under the overhead of my grant in the university infrastructure, magically, after the chemists did their experiments and poured it into a bottle, those bottles magically vanished. And they just, some person came, put it on a cart, wheeled it away, and I never saw it again. When I looked into the actual cost of doing that, it turns out that I was paying anywhere from 3 times to 5 times the amount of money to get rid of the molecules as I was to buy the molecules. But because my grants, the checks that I was writing as the principal investigator didn't involve the, you know, the disposal costs, because that was somewhere else in my organization, I wasn't even really aware of that reality. And when you look at that from a corporate perspective, it's not so much the amount of molecules that go into the product that ends up costing a lot of money. It's the molecules that aren't ending up in the product that have to be sent to a landfill, that have to be incinerated, that have to be disposed of. That cost is usually massive. And so if a technology, a green chemistry technology, is on the surface cost-effective and performance functional, normally a deeper dive into the economics finds that it's even more palatable. But that takes a special skill that isn't universal in actually recognizing those different externalities. There are many more. Liability costs, insurance costs, training. You know, if people are working with a material that's potentially hazardous in your manufacturing, well, they have to undergo additional training. You're going to be paying a higher premium for insurance. There's going to be, you know, all other risks with community interpretations, you know, storage costs. are far more expensive when you've got hazardous materials. And so the list goes on and on and on. But the person inventing the molecule, the person inventing the technology to solve a problem is often unaware of those externalities. So in one way of looking at it, the toxicity and environmental impact is an externality, but there are a bunch of others that are often not even taken into consideration at the design stage.
Mm-hmm. Well, given that, I have some interesting questions. I'm going to go next to the one that says, how would you judge today's chemical industry position and attitude towards green chemistry?
I would argue this. We wrote the book in 1998. It came out. It was written 3 or 4 years before that, and we're talking about it before that. So easily 20 years we've been at it. I have found it's really interesting. There is the perception of green chemistry, and then there is the green chemistry that I embrace, that I see. I have gone to different companies in which I hadn't visited before, and their perception of green chemistry leave them. You can almost look at the faces of the people as I come in the room. It's like, oh, we heard this, oh my God, this. But then after I describe it the way that I look at green chemistry, it's like, we get it. Of course, automatically, yes. And so what I have found is almost universal acceptance of green chemistry from industry. There are very large companies that have introduced the 12 principles of green chemistry as part of their stage gate process. There are large companies that are teaching green chemistry as a part of their orientation to the chemists that they hire. So I would say that industry is universally. However, I will find that I get far more pushback from academic organizations that, oh, our curriculum is already much too full. We can't really add any more to our curriculum, or, or more interesting, industry doesn't really want this. And, actually, I hear that quite often. I go, well, wait a minute, but I'm just coming from companies. They do want it. So in an ironic and weird way, it feels to me that industry gets it a little bit more than academia at this point. And so, going back to my whole concept of if you build a better mousetrap, people will be to pass to your door, it isn't, I don't see barriers to adoption of green chemistry technologies in industry. I see barriers in inventing them in the first place. And it's a really big difference. So it feels, sometimes it feels like, oh my God, there's so many problems with getting these safe technologies into commerce. Well, maybe there are on occasion, but really at the end of the day, if it's not functional, if it doesn't work as good enough, or it's too expensive, those barriers are technical, and those are barriers of innovation, and that's no different than any other product that industry sells. The pharmaceutical industry wants to make very good drugs that cure sick people that are profitable. All right, that's a statement. That's obvious. Then why aren't they more productive? Why is it that there's an exponential increase in R&D spending in the pharmaceutical industry, but a decline in actual number of new drugs being invented? It's not a desire. It's an ability. We lack the ability to innovate and create new products and materials. Whether it's related to the environment or not is irrelevant. It's a creativity and innovation issue. I think green chemistry industry is recognizing is not only good from a sustainability perspective, but it's actually helping in their innovation process as well, because it is a new and different paradigm of how to look at materials. It provides them with a different starting position to solve problems. And so you kind of get your cake and eat it too. It's an innovative tool and a sustainability tool.
Somebody asked, can you talk about some of the big pollution or environmental health problems we have that you think are ripe for green chemistry innovations in the near term?
Well, it's interesting. I get asked this question a lot. There are a lot of times reporters are doing a piece on green chemistry, and they do this question, and they interview a bunch of different scientists, and each scientist is passionate about one field that they've been working on, and they say, this is the field that needs to be worked on, this is the field that needs to be worked on. And I resist that. I actually think that if you go back and you train chemists to understand mechanisms of toxicity and environmental impact, then it doesn't matter which problem they're working on. They're all important, and we have to make progress on all of them. So why arbitrarily pick one or two or three or four different things to focus on when at the end of the day it's not the application? Remember, green chemistry is application agnostic. It's more about the process of inventing, of making materials. And so it's almost self-defeating to identify key areas. If a chemist is inventing a material in any field and they understand toxicity, environmental impact a little better, then we're accomplishing our goal.
But wouldn't you say that just in terms of what you just said, and in terms of the decision of what molecules to create and where to apply the innovation, wouldn't we set some kind of priorities? I mean, aren't there some issues which are more pressing, problems which are more pressing in terms of applying that innovative approach?
Well, I guess there's my opinion, but to me, I don't mean to be trite on this. Obviously these are real important issues. Right, these are real important issues. There are people that are passionate about endocrine disruption. I feel that that is a very important problem, and we really need to be working on endocrine disruption and materials that have been identified as being endocrine disruptors. At the same time, there are materials that are in commerce that are carcinogens, and I think, man, they got to be taken out because they're causing huge problems. There are materials that have suspected neurotoxicity. We need to be dealing with that. There are materials that cause birth defects. There are materials that cause, global climate change. There are materials that cause air pollution. I can go on and on and on and on, but I would be presumptuous to say, in my opinion, this is the most important issue. I'm just a person. I want people to be working on all of them. I don't want to be picking and choosing the one that I think, is important. I lost a child to biliary atresia. The causes of that and the things obviously are prevalent in my mind, and I feel that that's the most important thing we should be working on. But I'm just one person. For this to work, everyone needs to be pursuing their passion, and there shouldn't be someone passing judgment of which is more important. There are a lot of chemists out there. There are a lot of problems out there. People should be working in the fields that they're passionate about and that they want to solve those problems to. And I wouldn't be so presumptuous to say that, I have some gifted insight of which one is more important.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. I think that part of that question comes from the talking about earlier, which is the ability to get funding, and that the funding agencies tend to prioritize certain issues at any given time as the big challenge of the day, if you know what I'm saying.
Right. No. Well, definitely. And that is the reality of the world, that, nanotechnology in the last decade or so has received well over $11 billion of funding. You'd be hard-pressed to find a university or a college anywhere in the country that doesn't have a course on nanotechnology, a center of nanotechnology, or something around nanotechnology. Is that because the field of nanotechnology became so exciting, or is it because nanotechnology became so fundable? And you're absolutely right that the answer to the question that I just gave was a very, very philosophical discussion. In the real world, you're absolutely right. That's not the way it works. That funding is made available because a group of people make a good case for something. I still feel that if we picked one or two endpoints and got significant funding for those endpoints, the world is better off than not. But I would rather the endpoint be the education of chemists to understand toxicity, environmental impacts across the board, rather than roll the dice on one or two different squares. Why not pick them all and look at the process of education in general? But case taken, absolutely. In the real world, it's all about some program officer at the NSF having a program to fund a program of the NIH, and until that happens to some substantial level, nothing happens. And so
yeah.
I'm talking in both directions here.
Yeah. I think it's also a question of, in your opinion, obviously, only, but are there problems that we see out there, I mean, you named a number of them with the endocrine disruptors and carcinogens, et cetera, that you closer to, you know, that are really in that zone of, that are really, you can look at and say, you know, we really think that we could do green chemistry innovation, you know, around this problem, and it would be, it's a good place to focus right now because of the potential.
Well, yeah, and again, I think that many states, many organizations have put together lists of materials of concern. You know, I recognize the validity of that, and I would accept that those lists, you know, if people are identifying, you know, things as being critical to be replaced, then those are the most fundable areas for green chemistry to focus on. It's interesting from a technical perspective. It's you know the most fundable isn't necessarily the most doable, you know, and the most doable sadly isn't necessarily the most fundable. You know, so we could be spending a lot of money in an area that isn't ripe with solutions and not solving problems elsewhere because they weren't as sexy and as interesting to fund. And so that's why taking a step back and finding a way in which, you know, it's spread out a little bit thinner, but it's more universal, so that anyone who's in the business of creating a new material that's going to, you know, that didn't exist yesterday, I'm going to go in the lab and I'm going to make a new material today. There needs to be a day in the future where to do that, I must have been given some training to anticipate the toxicity and environmental impacts of what I'm about to do. And just picking and choosing a small subset is good from a funding perspective, but isn't really what the world needs. Ultimately, we need everything. You know, it needs to be a mindset change, and when we take, you know, very few people in the world have been, you know, given this cherished ability to conceive of mechanisms to make new compositions of matter. Not everyone does that, and so those people who do that have an obligation. I feel morally and ethical obligation, but also there is a competitive business case for understanding these endpoints, and until every person who's trained in this field is given those skills, we're still shoveling sand against the tide at some level, you know. And so, you know, the bigger picture is training across the board. You know, yes, if to get to that bigger picture of training, you know, people who are smarter than me feel that there are strategic ways of focusing on one specific endpoint because we can get funding faster. Well, great. The strategy to get to the endpoint is great, but at the end, you know, at the end of the day, it's the end that we want, not the means.
Yeah. So actually, I'm going to circle back around. I should have asked this question as a follow-up to an earlier question when I asked you about the chemical industry's position. But another question from another person says there are many industries that rely on products and machinery based on inventions and innovations during the World War II era. How do you suggest we, quote, crack, unquote, into those toxic-laden industries and change the culture to ask for and accept innovations? You may have already answered that, but I thought it was phrased a little differently, and so.
Yeah, and let me, and I apologize if this feels like a restatement, but it is, you know, important, and this is a little bit of a diatribe here, but, you know, why is it that we have the materials that we have today in commerce? Why is it that there's this, you know, subset of materials that are ubiquitous, that we make spoons out of it, we make clothing out of them, we make housing materials out of it, we make our electronics? How did we get to the point? Well, if we honestly look back in time, it was, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, the availability of commodity materials drove their use in different products. And so two people met and said, hey, I got tanker trucks full of this material. What can we do with it? And the availability of the material drove the innovation to find a use for those materials. And in the 50s and 60s, in the explosion of post-World War II innovation creativity, we came up with materials, and people innovated in the design level to find uses for those materials. So in my opinion, it was very rare that it happened the other way around. We need to find, I want a spoon, what should I use to make a spoon? It was the opposite. It was, I have this polymer. Hey, maybe I could make a spoon out of it. And I think that that's really important to realize, because now in 2012, when we look at the problems and we say we want to replace this material, I think we have this myth of the inventor defining all the properties and everything and saying, okay, I must invent something to replace this molecule. Well, man, that molecule has been around for 30 or 40 years. It has evolved in an industrial process to be cost-effective, fit all of these specific needs that have evolved over time. The belief that we can come up with a drop-in technology that's going to just replace it, do it just as good and the same cost, that's a tall order, and I think it's going to be rare to ever happen. What we really need to do, and there is, again, in my opinion, no mechanism to do this, is recreate that past. If we could come up with cost-effective materials, if academic scientists, if innovators could come up with materials that were sustainable by all measures, it's non-toxic, it's cost-effective, it's plentiful, it's good for the environment, and then we ask the design community to find a use for these materials, we could make a great deal of headway. That is the path to a sustainable future, not one by one trying to go backwards in time and re-engineer something that has evolved through decades and decades of work. So in my opinion, I bifurcate. There is going back and replacing the nasties. But from an economic perspective, if you've got an installed infrastructure of capital equipment, that design parameters are so narrow that it's possible that we can't do it. I again, don't believe anything's ever not doable, but it's really, really difficult. And so that's where we need incentives or help from government agencies or market-driven incentives to take that economic risk of recapitalizing equipment because a drop-in doesn't exist. So a certain amount of effort needs to be going backwards in time to do that. And one could argue that, well, man, if this factory was built 30 years ago, long before green chemistry, well, okay. But now green chemistry exists. And if a company opens up today and starts a factory today and isn't consistent with the 12 principles of green chemistry, we got to scratch our heads and ask why. That's a different story. That's, in my opinion, unconscionable. Now we do have the field of green chemistry. We can consider these things. And so any new factory that doesn't have a very active effort to consider these things, and I suspect they do have a fairly substantial effort to try to consider these things, but everyone could always be a little better. But that's different. So and that's where, again, I think that the critical thing is to make sure that all future chemists, and I don't mean just the ones in school, but the ones that are working in industry now, learn these things so that the future, there is nothing stopping us from making sustainable products in the future. It might be hard, not impossible, to replace things in the past, but there is no excuse not to do it right going forward. And so those are two very separate ways of accomplishing those goals, but it's important to recognize that there's two.
Great. So I have a few more questions here. And I think this is one you're going to really like. It says, if we're not training green chemists properly, are we doing any better with industrial toxicologists?
Well, I guess I am a chemist, so I can comment on how we train chemists. It would be presumptuous of me to comment on how we train toxicologists. It's not my field. I do believe that the mechanism to evaluate materials, the field of toxicology, the field of environmental health sciences, does exist and is getting better, and as a field, there are more papers being published, more journals being published, more meetings being had, more people getting degrees. Those fields are growing, and the fields of assessing toxicity, of looking at and coming up with new assays and ways of looking at molecules is growing. Could it grow faster? Could it grow better? Probably, but that's not my field. In my opinion, what's not happening is the people who make molecules, the people who go in the lab to create molecules, are still today fundamentally unaware of those people that are developing the assays and coming up with the mechanisms of toxicity. And so green chemistry, there's a whole other group of people who have to talk about environmental health sciences and toxicology and whether they're doing that right or wrong. Green chemistry is, are they communicating their results to the people who are designing materials? And that's the difference with green chemistry. Green chemistry isn't about designing new tests of assaying the toxicity of material. It is communicating those findings to the designers so that they don't use the materials that have been identified as being problematic from a variety of assays. Okay, and so so that's the distinction.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask two questions which are related. They're not exactly the same, but I think that they're close enough. And the first questioner was a colleague recently argued that there is no difference between man-made and natural matter. I don't agree. A duck and a pond have the same end of life. But could we ever, or if we work on it under green chemistry, isn't part of the problem that it's the quantity of man-made products, not just the quality in chemistry in the product? And the other questioner who asked something which I think is related is, can you talk about the ways that you use biomimicry at your lab, if at all?
Okay. So first one, at some level, this is I apologize if I sound heretical, but in an absolute sense, if the 12 principles of green chemistry are being applied, it shouldn't matter where in nature that material started. Okay, obviously, if one goes and sees a tree, climbs up in a tree, wraps the branches of the arms of the tree around them, and says, "This is my house," that's as close to nature as you can possibly come in using a natural material. If, on the other hand, you take and extract that material and you make a polymer out of it, and then you take that polymer and you make a board out of it, then you bang that board together to make a house, there are some number of steps that are always going to have to happen between the natural world and the human-built world. Maybe it's one step, we just extract a material from a flower, or it's 12 synthetic steps in some factory somewhere on the planet. In an absolute sense, it shouldn't matter. If green chemistry is being applied, whether it's if the people that are doing the 12 synthetic steps are safe and it's non-toxic and it's not using a whole bunch of environment, heck, we're actually creating jobs and building an economy around that process. If it's truly green and safe, it really shouldn't matter how far away. Everything is ultimately from biology. Petroleum feedstocks 100 million years ago were trees that were buried under the ground, organic molecules that were buried under the ground over 100 million years, and all the functionality is extracted out of it and turned into petroleum. Ultimately, everything is coming from nature. The goal of green chemistry is not to be judgmental of which is better and which isn't better. I may have my own personal opinion than others would, and maybe there's market advantage to how close to nature a product is. But our job in green chemistry is to say it shouldn't matter. If every step of the process is safe, if every step of the process is not, is consistent with the 12 principles of green chemistry, it shouldn't matter. Now, digressing on that, there are many materials in nature that the process of extracting them from nature generates more toxicity than the process of manufacturing them in a classical sense. It is never so straightforward and easy to say that, well, gee, something derived from nature is somehow better inherently from a sustainability perspective. Obviously, if it's a food crop, questions come up. If there's genetic modification, questions come up. If there's certain, landscape, environmental degradation because of the extraction of the natural material, there's always going to be bigger issues. And so it's not, in my opinion, so simple as to say a bio-derived material is better than something that had several synthetic steps in between. It's just, sadly and sometimes frustratingly, just not so simple. And so it depends on each case, has to be evaluated, and people's sets of values kind of apply to that. Now, as far as biomimicry is concerned, I think biomimicry is brilliant. I think Janine Benyus's book on biomimicry is absolutely fantastic, and I myself can feel myself a follow-up. Actually, when I was a professor teaching organic chemistry at the university, I used to require my students to actually buy Janine's biomimicry book for organic chemistry students to actually get that kind of inspiration in what they're doing. Yes, biomimicry and green chemistry should be intimately hand in hand. One can do green chemistry without biomimicry, but I think it's easier in a better design set environment to use biomimicry. Is it essential? No, people can do it in other ways too. My opinion, it is a great first step. Now, can you do biomimicry using toxic materials? Oh, absolutely. I can make gecko tape with toxic materials using a ton of energy. So it is necessarily something that's biomimetic or following the principles of biomimicry necessarily good for the environment? Not necessarily. And so I think green chemistry and biomimicry together are an absolute essential way forward.
Approximately how much does it cost to refill the product and alternate production process and alternate production processes using green chemical principles? We realize they vary considerably due to complexity of issue, but a ballpark figure would be interesting. And then from a more specific perspective, somebody said, thanks for putting the information into clear language. Given what you said, you advise those of us who are commenting on the regs, economic arguments that will at least tone down the industry's opposition.
Okay. As far as the cost, yeah, the prices are all over the place. But in general, you're looking at anywhere from $500,000 to $1.5 million to develop a technology that is going to be a replacement of an existing material. Now, again, defining all the parameters that technology must do makes that problem all that much more difficult, as I described. And the more tighter those specifications are, the cost is going to go up because the process is that much more difficult. So, it's important to recognize that. But I want to take this opportunity, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, to talk about a different, take on this question. Let's say that you're a company and you realize that there is a material in one of your products that the public perceives as being toxic. Now, you may or may not agree with them, but at some point it doesn't matter. There are market forces that are telling you you must replace this material. So you're looking at millions of dollars of investment to come up with that technology, but the problem is let's say you're successful and you come up with a new technology. How do you know that what you make isn't going to be equally toxic? If it's a new material, then the assumption is that no one's done any tests because it's a new material. Do we have a subset of tests that we can unequivocally say to a company and say, hey, listen, if you are willing to go down this path, obviously you face a bunch of risk. Right now, if I come up with a new material, as I described earlier in my presentation, the person who identifies my new material as being toxic is going to be made a hero. And so everyone wants to find out that, wow, John Warner came up with this new material to replace, compound XYZ, and guess what? It's just as toxic as the other. All right, there's going to be a lot of funding for people to do tox tests, and I can't keep up with that. So am I better off just going into the courts and fighting the legislation? Because I know that if I do come up with an alternative, I'm just starting at square one all over again. How can I have some comfort that have evaluated it. And so I think that that's a critical thing. And Pete Myers and Karen O'Brien started an organization that has been evaluating this for the subset of the field of endocrine disruption. Can we put together, not telling industry what not to do, not making a list and saying this molecule's bad and this molecule's bad, but giving them a set of assays and a set of results of those assays and said, if you make a material and you do these tests and they perform in such a way, then you have done the best that you can under today's level of understanding to go forward. That is the missing element going forward in our program, because people, organizations would be willing to invest the technology, but if they get to the exact same endpoint and where now the new material is perceived to be just as bad or worse, then where is their incentive to spend the money? So we need to really think about how do we measure what is safe and give them, industry is based on investments and calculations of risk and cost and all of that. Can we set up a battery of tests that do that? I use as my analogy, we go to a doctor's appointment and we get a blood test. And when we get a blood test, there are millions of tests that the doctor could take. But depending on our history, depending on what's going on in our life, some subset of tests done in that blood test to evaluate our general health and diagnose what's going on. Can we, in a similar way, look at a battery of tests for materials and figure out what criteria would be applied to what family of materials and give a concrete, unequivocal set of tests? Now, no one is being asked to say this is safe. We can never say something is safe. The best we'll ever be able to do is say, based on our current awareness, this is safe. But we don't know. Someone could find out tomorrow that that which we think is safe today is dangerous tomorrow. Can we at least meet halfway and come up with some proposal that tells industry what they need to do to at least be perceived as doing the right thing? And that is the bigger part, in my opinion, of the cost-benefit analysis. It's not the actual cost of inventing, but it's the cost of inventing and then ending up exactly where you started with, because it's not quite precisely defined what we mean when we say safe. And that's a really naughty question. It's a very difficult question, and I tip my hat to Pete Myers and Karen O'Brien for tackling this in endocrine disruption, but we got a lot more to do.
John, much of the talk was about how chemists view green chemistry. How is the business world viewing green chemistry, and are they demanding schools to teach their students these methods? Who is advocating green chemistry to them?
Okay. For the last, 10, 12 years, I have gone to business schools across the country and the world that in the same way in chemistry, very few universities embrace green chemistry, very few departments embrace green chemistry, but as time has evolved, every university, every chemistry department has an individual or two or three or four that have become passionate about green chemistry, embrace it into what they do. And the field of green chemistry is growing through the increase in the number of individuals that are participating. I would argue that systematically departments aren't getting on board as much in universities, but individuals are multiplying. And at some point we'll hit a critical mass, and the work that Amy Cannon is doing in Beyond Benign is promoting this and is being very successful. The same thing's happening in B schools. I have been going to business schools for well over 10 years. I've gone to business schools in South Africa, in Europe, in Asia, and the United States, at least 6 states. And I got to tell you that as time is going by, I'm being invited to more of them, and there are more faculty getting on board thinking about it. Andrea Larson down at Darden was one of the early pioneers. There are people, up at McGill. There are people at Stanford, at Babson, at Harvard. So I see individuals that are recognizing the value of this and putting it into their teaching. It hasn't, in the same way it hasn't in chemistry, become manifest as part of the formal curriculum. It's becoming available for those individuals who want to learn. I won't rest until it's part of the curriculum for all people, not just the self-motivated, but anyone going into the field. And I think that there's great cause for comfort that things are happening. Am I impatient? Do I want things to happen faster? Absolutely. But it's happening, and it's been happening for the last 10 years, and it seems to me, anecdotally at least, to be increasing.
John, do you have any closing thoughts before we end the webinar?
It's interesting, Lynn. You were pushing me to identify, what I think are the most important issues that we should be doing in green chemistry, and I resisted, because I think philosophically we need to train the next generation of scientists. But obviously, the way market forces work, if you were to walk through the halls of my institute and you were to look at all the nasty molecules that organizations have put on lists, there is a direct correlation. We are working, on replacing bisphenol A in certain products. We're looking at replacing flame retardants in certain products. We're looking at coming up with alternative plastics for certain products. We're working on biodegradation. We're working on persistence of fluorinated materials. So pretty much every molecule that there's a list of, there is an organization that's working with the institute in their particular sector to help come up with innovative replacements. So that is the low-hanging fruit of necessity, and that is why the work of consumer advocate groups and government regulation is so important. That change, that low-hanging fruit, well, not really low-hanging fruit from a solution perspective, but from identifying a problem perspective, is critical. So again, we talked about this earlier when we were saying that green chemistry isn't a replacement for that mindset, that these things go hand in hand, and that it's not an either or, that you either focus on regulations and consumer awareness or you do green chemistry. We're on the same team. We're all working together, and I got to tell you, the business that the Institute is in, obviously the organizations that are trying to find problems are responding probably to a regulatory or a consumer need, and so that is pushing the world forward. We got to get off of that. Someday it has to be that every scientist just learns this, and it's not a reaction to identifying something bad. It's the desire to make something good in the first place. But that's a distant future. Today, most of the work that I'm seeing going on is a direct result of an activist group or a regulatory group that is applying pressure to come up with these alternatives. And so right now it's there's a lot of work for all of us to do.
Thank you so much, John. This is fantastic, and I know that everybody who has tuned in and all the people that will listen to it on the web I'll be very grateful for the time that you've devoted to us to answer these questions and to talk about work that's going on in green chemistry. So thank you again, and let me remind everybody that this entire webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the website www.glgc.org and also www.migreenchemistry.org. So thanks again, John, and thanks to everybody for listening.